Hey everyone. Tonight, before you fall asleep, I want you to imagine something simple. It's late. You're walking toward your city. You can see the lights. You can hear voices inside the walls. And then, the gate closes. For the next 8 hours, that city, your city, will not open for anyone. Not even for kings, unless they planned ahead. For hundreds of years, medieval cities across Europe locked themselves every single night. On purpose. Like a living thing pulling its limbs inward. Tonight, we're talking about why. Not because of wars, but because of fear, darkness, fire, and a deep belief that nighttime simply did not belong to ordinary people. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Now, medieval cities were not being dramatic. They weren't trying to trap people or create suspense. They were practical, cautious, and deeply uncomfortable with the idea of humans wandering freely after dark. During the day, a medieval city was loud and crowded. Markets shouted. Animals moved freely. Children ran through narrow streets. At night, that same city became something else entirely. There were no streetlights, no glowing windows, no soft background hum of electricity. Just darkness. And medieval darkness wasn't empty. It was thick, uneven, full of places where things could hide. Streets were narrow, twisted, and often wet. Sometimes from rain, sometimes from things best not examined too closely. Once the sun dipped low, bells rang out. Not cheerful bells. These were warnings. Shops closed immediately. Stalls packed up. People hurried home with a sense of urgency modern life rarely requires. Because everyone knew what came next. The gates. Heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron would begin to move. Chains dragged, bolts slid into place, slowly, deliberately. And when they shut, the city was sealed. Anyone inside stayed inside. Anyone outside stayed out. This wasn't just about enemies. In fact, most nights, no one was attacking. The real dangers were smaller, quieter. Fire, for example. One candle, one spark, one careless hearth. Most medieval buildings were made of wood, straw, and optimism. Fire spread quickly, too quickly. So nighttime rules were strict. Fires were covered, candles monitored, ovens cooled. Even walking around at night was suspicious. If you were awake and outside, you had explaining to do. Which brings us to the night watch. Every city had them. Ordinary men given authority, a weapon, and a long night. They patrolled streets slowly, calling out the hours. Not to comfort you, but to remind you that someone was watching. If they found you wandering without reason, you could be stopped, questioned, detained until morning. No charges required. Because the assumption was simple. Nothing good happened at night. And sometimes they were right. Thieves preferred darkness. So did smugglers. So did people trying to disappear. Strangers were especially unwelcome. Medieval cities were intensely local. People recognized faces. Accents mattered. If you didn't belong, the night was not the time to prove otherwise. And if you arrived late, that was your problem. Cities rarely reopened gates after sunset. Doing so risked chaos. So travelers learned quickly, arrive early or don't arrive at all. Those who failed slept outside the walls, on roads, in fields, in makeshift inns beyond the gates. The irony, of course, is that by locking themselves for safety, cities created a ring of danger just outside their walls. But medieval logic was often like that. Inside the city, people settled in. Doors were barred. Families crowded into small rooms. Everyone listened. Sleep came lightly. Homes were noisy. Beds were shared. Privacy barely existed. Yet people preferred this to the alternative. Even kings feared the night. Royal residences locked down harder than any city gate. Corridors closed, doors bolted, guards stationed inside the palace itself. Some kings slept surrounded by attendants, not for luxury, but protection. Assassination rarely announced itself politely. Even monasteries treated night as something to control. Lights out meant silence. Movement required permission. Darkness was disciplined. And still, people adapted. They slept in 2 shifts, woke briefly in the middle of the night, prayed, whispered, then slept again. All of it done indoors, behind walls, within rules. Because outside, the city belonged to no one. Tonight, after the gates have closed and the city has gone quiet, we'll drift gently upward, away from the narrow streets and into the cold stone rooms where medieval royalty began their lives. Because while kings and queens liked to present themselves as chosen by God, divinely protected, and generally superior in every way, their childhoods were often uncomfortable, medically confusing, and emotionally strange, especially the childhoods of royal children. Now, you might imagine royal babies being coddled, adored, and carefully raised in luxury. And yes, there were silks, and gold, and very expensive cradles. But there was also an astonishing amount of neglect, misunderstanding, and fatal optimism. To begin with, medieval royal children rarely saw their parents. This wasn't because their parents were busy, though they were. It was because medieval parenting among elites believed distance built character. A newborn prince or princess was usually handed off to a household of nurses, servants, tutors, and attendants almost immediately. The mother recovered, the father resumed ruling, and the child was raised nearby, but not with them. This separation was considered sensible. After all, children were fragile, emotionally inconvenient, and statistically unreliable. Infant mortality was high, even among royalty. So bonding too closely was seen as risky. Why grow attached when fate might intervene? Which is a gentle way of saying, don't get too fond of the baby until it survives a few winters. Royal nurseries were often placed in separate wings, separate buildings, or even separate estates. The child grew up surrounded by staff, not family. Nurses were crucial figures, wet nurses in particular. Many royal babies were not breastfed by their mothers. Instead, a carefully selected wet nurse would feed them. This was thought to improve health, or temperament, or both. Also, it allowed the queen to become pregnant again more quickly, which, from a dynastic perspective, was considered efficient. These nurses could become the closest emotional bond a royal child ever had, sometimes more trusted than parents, sometimes more mourned. But even nurses worked under strict rules. Babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped so firmly they could barely move. This was believed to straighten limbs and calm the spirit. In reality, it mostly ensured discomfort. Fresh air was considered dangerous. Cold was feared, so rooms were kept warm, sometimes too warm. Disease thrived quietly. And medicine, well, medieval medicine had confidence. Accuracy was optional. Children who cried too much might be bled. Children who slept too much might be bled. Children who didn't sleep enough also bled. Balance was everything, and balance was achieved by removing blood. Royal children suffered frequent illnesses, fevers, digestive problems, skin conditions. Some were born with visible deformities. Others developed issues slowly. And then there was the matter of inbreeding. Royal families married within a narrow circle, again and again and again. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Aunts married nephews. Not always, but often enough to create patterns. Fragile immune systems, unusual facial features, delayed development. These were politely ignored, or described in flattering terms. A weak child was considered delicate. A sickly prince was considered thoughtful. A child with a pronounced jaw was considered noble-looking. And sometimes they were simply hidden. Royal children were expected to be perfect symbols. If they weren't, the narrative adjusted. Education began early, very early. By age 5 or 6, a prince was expected to begin learning languages, scripture, etiquette, and history. A princess learned reading, needlework, music, and, most importantly, obedience. Play existed, but it was structured. Games were moral lessons. Toys were symbolic. Everything had a purpose. And childhood ended quickly. At 7, boys might be sent away to another court to be fostered. This was considered excellent training. It also ensured they grew up among strangers, learning loyalty to institutions rather than people. Girls were prepared for marriage from an early age, sometimes discussed as future brides before they could read. And marriage loomed. For royal children, adulthood arrived abruptly, often before puberty. Betrothals were signed when children were toddlers. Marriages sometimes followed shockingly early. A princess of 12 was not considered young. She was considered ready. Ready to move, ready to conceive, ready to represent alliances far beyond her understanding. And if she wasn't ready, history did not pause. The emotional lives of these children were rarely considered. Their value was political. Their bodies were assets. Their survival was important, but not guaranteed. Some royal children were painfully aware of their replaceability. If one died, another would be born. If not, a cousin would do. This created a strange psychological atmosphere. Affection existed, yes, but it was cautious, measured. Even birthdays were understated. Too much celebration tempted fate. Religion reinforced this mindset. Children were taught that suffering was normal, that illness was God's will, that obedience mattered more than happiness.
Let's settle back in once more. Nothing sudden is coming. No battles, no betrayals shouted across stone halls. Just paperwork, promises, and a series of marriages that, with the benefit of hindsight and modern genetics, were always going to be a problem. Now, medieval and early modern royalty loved marriage. Not romance, of course. Marriage as a concept, as a tool, as a solution to nearly every political inconvenience. Need peace? Marriage. Need land? Marriage. Need to secure a claim that is already confusing? Definitely marriage. And so the same families married into each other again, and again, and then, just to be safe, again. Because why look outward when your cousin is right there? Royal marriage was never about compatibility. It was about bloodlines staying pure, alliances staying predictable, and power staying in familiar hands. Unfortunately, biology did not share these priorities. Let's begin gently with the idea of cousin marriage. Today, it makes people uncomfortable. In the medieval world, it made people feel secure. Marrying a cousin meant you knew exactly what you were getting. Same family, same traditions, same enemies. The church technically banned close kin marriages, but dispensations were easy to obtain, especially if you were wealthy, powerful, or very insistent. and royalty was usually all three. So, cousins married. Second cousins, first cousins once removed, occasionally first cousins, very directly, sometimes even closer. These unions were justified with impressive paperwork and enthusiastic theology. And then came the children. At first, everything seemed fine. The first generation often survived, mostly. It was later generations where things became noticeable. The most famous example, of course, is the Habsburg family. They did not ease into inbreeding, they committed to it. Over centuries, the Habsburgs married almost exclusively within a small circle of relatives. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. Family trees folded inward like collapsing tents. This produced impressive territorial stability and increasingly fragile people. The most famous outcome was Charles II of Spain. He was born into a lineage that had been genetically rehearsing the same marriage over and over. By the time Charles arrived, the gene pool was more of a gene puddle. He suffered from severe physical and intellectual disabilities. He struggled to walk. He struggled to speak clearly. He struggled to rule. He was described as having a large head, a protruding jaw, and a body that seemed perpetually unwell. The famous Habsburg jaw was no longer subtle. It was architectural. Doctors attempted to help. Naturally, they made things worse. Bleeding, potions, exorcisms. Because when medicine fails, the supernatural is always invited in. Charles married twice. Neither marriage produced children, which, given his health, was not surprising. When he died, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, quietly, with paperwork. But he was not unique. Across Europe, royal marriages quietly produced children who were weak, sickly, infertile, or short-lived. These outcomes were rarely blamed on genetics. Instead, they were blamed on God's will, evil influences, poor wet nurses, the wrong foods, or occasionally the mother. It was almost never blamed on the family tree. Queens, especially, bore the weight of these failures. A queen who failed to produce healthy heirs was considered a disappointment, or worse. Never mind that she had been chosen precisely because she was related to the king. Never mind that the problem was shared. Responsibility flowed downward. Some queens endured repeated pregnancies in quick succession, urged to try again. Each pregnancy weakened them further. Many died young. Royal marriage contracts rarely mentioned emotional well-being. They mentioned dowries, territories, titles. Love was optional. Silence was expected. In some cases, the couple barely knew each other. Languages differed, customs clashed, personalities misaligned. But they were expected to produce heirs efficiently. And when the heirs arrived, they were watched closely. Every cough mattered. Every delay in walking raised concern. Physicians whispered. Courtiers speculated. Was the child weak? Was the bloodline failing? And if a child died, the response was grimly practical. Mourn, briefly, then produce another. Some royal families tried to course correct. They married outward. They sought foreign alliances. But even then, alliances often brought in other families with their own histories of internal marriage. Europe's royal houses were interconnected in a way that made avoiding shared ancestry almost impossible. Everyone was related, some more visibly than others. Even Queen Victoria, often portrayed as a stabilizing grandmother of Europe, unknowingly spread hemophilia through her royal marriages. The disease passed quietly through her descendants, appearing unexpectedly in royal sons who bruised easily, bled excessively, and died young. Again, blame was misplaced. Mothers were accused of weakness. Doctors blamed childhood injuries. The concept of inherited conditions was poorly understood, and yet the pattern persisted. Royal marriages also produced strange domestic arrangements. Some couples lived apart. Some openly disliked each other. Others treated marriage as a formality. Kings took mistresses. Queens endured. Illegitimate children sometimes thrived better than legitimate ones, which was inconvenient, because legitimacy mattered more than health. In some cases, royal couples delayed consummation. Child brides were married in ceremony but not in practice for a time, but eventually duty resumed. And so the cycle continued. One particularly bleak example can be found in the later medieval French monarchy. Kings married young women repeatedly. Queens died young. Children survived unpredictably. The pressure to produce male heirs was relentless. A queen who produced only daughters might find herself quietly sidelined or replaced. Annulments were possible, especially if no children arrived. The church could be persuaded that a marriage had never truly existed, which was convenient. And so, royal marriage became both sacred and disposable. Sacred when it served power, disposable when it did not. The emotional toll was considerable. Many royals lived lonely lives within marriage, bound by contract, limited by expectation. Some turned inward, some outward. Some into religion, some into cruelty, and some into indifference, which shaped their rule. A king raised without affection, married without choice, surrounded by courtiers who treated him as a symbol rather than a person, often ruled accordingly. Not dramatically, just poorly. So when we hear of indecisive monarchs and irritable rulers or kings obsessed with legacy, it's worth remembering the environment that shaped them. Marriage was not comfort, it was obligation. And genetics were not consulted. As the centuries passed, some royal families began to notice the pattern. Gradually, reluctantly. They widened marriage pools. They sought distant alliances. Science crept in. But for a long time, tradition outweighed evidence, because tradition felt safe and change felt dangerous. So as you rest now, imagine a quiet royal bedroom, a marriage bed that represents an alliance between nations, two people who barely know each other, both aware that their union will be judged not by happiness, but by survival. And in a moment, we'll drift onward again, into kings and queens whose personalities, shaped by these systems, made governance feel like a personal inconvenience. But for now, just breathe.
All right. If you're still awake, don't worry. That's normal. History has a way of lingering politely in the background. Let's drift onward now, away from marriage contracts and fragile heirs, and into the day-to-day behavior of the people who actually sat on the thrones. Because while medieval and early modern monarchs liked to project authority, wisdom, and divine favor, many of them were, in practice, astonishingly petty. Not dramatically evil, not cartoonishly mad, just difficult, and often deeply annoying. Let's begin with the simple fact that absolute power does not encourage emotional growth. If no one can contradict you, correct you, or tell you to calm down, you never really learn how. And many monarchs reached adulthood having never been meaningfully challenged. They were obeyed as children, praised excessively, punished rarely and inconsistently. So when they became rulers, their personalities came with them, fully formed, untreated. One of the most common royal flaws was stubbornness. Kings refused to change their minds, not because they were right, but because changing one's mind suggested weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. There are countless records of monarchs insisting on policies that were clearly failing, simply because admitting failure felt worse than continuing. Naturally, this made everything worse.
Some kings developed grudges that lasted decades. A noble who spoke out of turn, a courtier who failed to bow deeply enough, a foreign ruler who used the wrong title in a letter. These slights were remembered carefully, patiently, and then repaid eventually in ways that seemed wildly disproportionate. Titles revoked, estates confiscated, careers ended, all because of a moment that no one else remembered. Queens were no less capable of this behavior. Many queens, particularly those who ruled as regents or in their own right, had to fight constantly to be taken seriously, which sometimes resulted in hyper-control. They monitored court behavior obsessively, corrected etiquette, punished gossip. Not out of vanity, though sometimes that too, but out of necessity. Respect was fragile, and so control became survival. Still, pettiness found its way in. One queen famously banned a rival courtier from wearing the particular color simply because she wore it well. Another insisted that no woman could sit in her presence if she herself was standing, which led to some extremely uncomfortable ceremonies. Kings, meanwhile, often obsessed over symbols, seating arrangements, processions, who walked in front of whom. These details mattered more than policy, because symbols reinforced hierarchy, and hierarchy reinforced their sense of self. Some monarchs were deeply insecure. They obsessed over appearance, weight, height, hair. Portraits were carefully managed, flattering angles encouraged. If reality did not cooperate, art was instructed to improve it. He was known as the fair, chroniclers might write, which, translated gently, meant, please don't look too closely. Others leaned into intimidation, loud voices, public anger, displays of temper. These were not signs of confidence, they were tools. A king who shouted frequently did not have to explain himself, and explanations were exhausting. Court life encouraged these traits. Courtiers survived by telling monarchs what they wanted to hear. Honesty was dangerous. Silence was safer. So rulers lived in echo chambers long before the term existed. They were praised constantly, reassured endlessly, until they believed their own mythology. And when reality intervened, as it always does, they reacted poorly. Some kings blamed advisors for their own failures. Others blamed fate or God, rarely themselves. This led to frequent purges of court favorites. A trusted advisor would fall out of favor suddenly, banished, imprisoned, occasionally executed. The reason was often vague. He displeased the king, which was explanation enough. Favorites were dangerous because they were close. They knew things. They saw weaknesses. And eventually, proximity breeds resentment. So monarchs cycled through companions, never fully trusting any of them, which made governance erratic. Queens often faced a different kind of dysfunction: isolation. A queen in a foreign court was surrounded by people who did not share her language, customs, or loyalties. She was watched constantly, judged relentlessly. Loneliness became bitterness. Bitterness became control. Some queens lashed out quietly. Others withdrew completely. A withdrawn queen was often described as cold, or proud, or unnatural. No one asked if she was simply unhappy. Royal children, watching all of this, absorbed the lesson. Power meant distance. Emotion meant vulnerability. And so the cycle continued. Some monarchs developed peculiar habits: excessive cleanliness, or the opposite, obsession with routine, or complete disregard for it. One king insisted on eating at precisely the same time every day, regardless of circumstances. Another refused to eat in public at all, convinced he was being poisoned, which, to be fair, was not an entirely unreasonable fear. Paranoia was common. Plots existed. Conspiracies happened. But suspicion often expanded beyond evidence. Everyone became a potential threat, which made trust impossible. Some rulers compensated by retreating into ritual. Ceremony became their comfort. Daily routines, formal audiences, structured prayer. As long as the ritual continued, the world felt stable. Others rejected ritual entirely. They dressed simply, ignored protocol, spoke abruptly. This confused everyone, because monarchy relies on predictability. A king who behaved like a normal person unsettled the system. There were also rulers who seemed genuinely bored by ruling. Meetings irritated them. Documents annoyed them. They delegated excessively, or not at all. Some disappeared into hunting, leaving governance to others. Some disappeared into religion, others into indulgence. Court life offered distractions in abundance: food, music, mistresses, games. If ruling felt tedious, avoidance was easy. The consequences arrived later, quietly. A neglected treasury, unresolved disputes, growing resentment. But by then, it was someone else's problem. And then there were the rulers who were simply unpleasant. Not monstrous, just mean. They mocked courtiers, humiliated servants, and enjoyed reminding others of their place. Power amplifies personality. A mildly cruel person becomes intolerable when obeyed by thousands. These rulers left behind courts full of tension. No one relaxed. Everyone watched their words, which stifled creativity, honesty, and effective governance. And yet, these rulers often ruled for decades, because being disliked did not prevent survival. Being weak did. Some of the most dysfunctional rulers were not removed by rebellion or invasion. They simply lingered, growing older, more irritable, more disconnected. They outlived advisors, rivals, even children.